Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Law of Self-Defense. Let me straighten my camera a little bit. I guess I should figure out a better system for all of this. Welcome to the show, folks. Law of Self-Defense. I am, of course, Attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very pleased to be here. Always a pleasure to be with all of you from the self-defense community. If you are of the self-defense community, how do you know? Well, you might be watching this on your Law of Self-Defense member dashboard. That would be a good thing to do. If you are, I would encourage you. It looks like it's streaming live. Okay, great. Member dashboard's working. Chat there is working. So if you're a Law of Self-Defense member, you want your questions answered during today's show, please put it on the member dashboard chat. Those get prioritized. If you're watching on YouTube, and you see that subscribe button is colored red, you're doing it wrong, folks. If you have watched more than one or two of these shows and you are not yet a subscriber, you're doing it wrong. And that red button, that red subscribe button tells you that you're doing it wrong. So pound that subscribe button until it turns gray. Hit that like thumbs up button. That's, I'm told, the most important part of the YouTube algorithm is the number of likes. So please hit that like thumbs up button. We should have at least half of you hitting that thumbs up button. Looks like we have more than half, so good work. As more of you come in, please do that as well. And if you could leave a comment, that's always helpful in terms of engagement, even if your comment is only your city and state. Greatly appreciated. And of course, we have the sponsor of today's show, which is none other than Law of Self-Defense itself. In particular, we have one of our upcoming full-day live online classes, what we call our Law of Self-Defense Advanced class, a full day of self-defense law instruction, by the end of which you will be an expert on self-defense law, use of force law, defense of self, defense of others, defense of property, almost certainly more expertise than any attorney you're likely to bump into. We're not really taught this stuff in law school, folks. In my 3 years of law school, we spent maybe 5 minutes talking about self-defense. That was it. So you can think of this full-day class as the rough equivalent of a semester-long law school seminar on self-defense law, except taught in plain English, and you get to learn it all in a single day. We only do this class once or twice a year. We did one this spring. We have the next one coming up on Saturday, October 1st, and that's it until whenever we schedule them in 2023. And this is the legal knowledge you need to have in order to be able to decisively defend yourself, your family, your property, and be hard to convict. The only catch is we do have a limited number of seats available. The classes do fill up pretty quickly. So if you are interested in this, I would encourage you to sign up sooner rather than later. You can do that at lawofselfdefense.com/advanced, lawofselfdefense.com/advanced. Okay. With that out of the way, let me turn now to this matter again of Alec Baldwin. Never seems to quite go away. So last year, Alec Baldwin was on the set of a Western movie where he was the lead. He was handling a single action Western style revolver in .45 long Colt. He pointed the revolver at a human being, at a woman, Halyna Hutchins, the director of cinematography, pointed it directly at her, and the gun discharged. And a .45 long Colt round came out of the gun, the lead portion, of course, struck Halyna Hutchins fatally. She would die as a result. She leaves behind an orphan child, at least one, and of course a widowed husband. And ever since then, Alec Baldwin has been blaming this state of affairs, this tragic event, on everybody except Alec Baldwin. Yes, I'm not talking about Adam Baldwin. Adam Baldwin, I'm humbled to say, is a friend of mine. Alec Baldwin, the shooter here, most certainly is not, especially after my analysis of his use of force event. Alec Baldwin insists that he did nothing wrong. There may be other people responsible for this tragedy, but it's not him. Whoever is responsible, it's not Alec Baldwin. And he's back in the news now again because, well, for a number of reasons. One is that apparently there's been a leak of the FBI forensics examination of the pistol. And in that examination, the FBI says that the pistol functions normally, meaning that it's not able to fire unless the trigger has been pulled. So if you pull the hammer back halfway, roughly speaking, it falls into the half safe notch, and the hammer cannot drop from that position. Pull it back all the way, it falls to the full notch, and it can't fall from that position either unless the trigger is pulled. If you pull it less than halfway, it apparently doesn't have enough tension on it that when released, it would ignite the primer and fire the weapon. So the FBI forensic report, and of course, this is based on reporting. We don't have access to the report itself. It hasn't been released. But I can assure you that if the FBI report had concluded that the gun could fire itself simply by twiddling with the hammer a bit, we would know that. That would be the headline in all the Alec Baldwin propaganda stories. So this suggests that the gun, the pistol, the revolver in Alec Baldwin's hands could not have fired unless he pulled the trigger. He said all the while that he didn't pull the trigger, that the gun just went off by itself, which of course doesn't happen. If you set a gun on a table, it doesn't sit there and then when someone walks in front of the muzzle, discharge itself to strike that person. Guns don't fire themselves. They're fired when they're manipulated in a way to induce being fired. And now we have reports that the medical examiner of Halyna Hutchins has classified her death as an accident. This was news that came out in the last day or so. And both of these things, well, of course, Alec Baldwin's claim that he never pulled the trigger is supposed to support his narrative that whoever may be at fault here, it's not Alec Baldwin. And the touting of the medical examiner's report of this Halyna Hutchins' death being an accident is supposed to suggest to the general public that means nobody was at fault, right? Accidents happen. If it was an accident, it's nobody's responsibility. That's just the way the cookie crumbles, act of God and all that. So really nobody should be held accountable. There's a couple of problems here with that narrative. One is that, frankly, from my perspective, which is a legal perspective, not a medical perspective, it doesn't matter whether or not Alec Baldwin pulled the trigger or not. Well, I should say, if he pulled the trigger, it makes him even more culpable. But he was more than sufficiently culpable for criminal charges without having pulled the trigger. You don't have to do all the things to be criminally liable. You just have to do enough of the things to be criminally liable. If you don't do additional things, that would also be that would also create culpability. You still have the culpability of the actions you did take. I'll circle back to that in a moment. Another problem with this, the current version of the narrative involving the medical examiner's report, is, first of all, it's very questionable whether that's the appropriate finding, but I'll leave the science of the medical examination to the medical examiner. Even if one were to agree that it's a reasonable finding of the medical examiner to classify this death as an accident, that finding is a scientific finding. It's not a legal finding. The medical examiner could come to an accident finding simply based on the notion that the death of Halyna Hutchins was unintended. But there are plenty of unintended deaths that are not classified as accident by a medical examiner. And even when they are classified as accident by the medical examiner, they're still prosecuted as crimes. So an example would be a drunk driving vehicular homicide case. That death is unintentional. The drunk driver didn't intend to run anyone over on their drunken way home. What they did was they got drunk, they got behind the wheel of a car, they unintentionally ran somebody over and killed them. The lack of intention may lead the medical examiner to classify that death as an accident, meaning unintended. It's still a crime. It's a crime based on the reckless conduct of the drunk driver. So it could be an accident in the medical examiner's report and still a felony homicide for criminal law purposes. And that's what we get to here with the Alec Baldwin case. Now, to understand how this works, you have to understand that there's different states of mind, different mens rea that apply to different levels of legal culpability, all the way from 0 up to a premeditated murder, for example, where there's a death involved. 0 legal liability occurs in the context of accident in the legal sense of the term, not the medical examiner sense of the term. Is simply anything that's unintended. Legally, an accident is a bad result that occurs where there is actually no responsibility by any particular individual. In other words, there was no existing mental state by which, under our system of law, we could hold someone legally liable. An example of a genuine accident might be where you visit your aunt's apartment, for example. She lives on the 2nd floor, and she asks you to move a heavy bureau from one side of the room to the other side of the room. And she's your aunt, and she's elderly, so you're happy to do that for her. You pick up the heavy bureau, you lift it up, you move it to the other side of the room, you put it down, and unbeknownst to you, and unknowable to you, the floor joists below the new spot where you place the bureau have been eaten out by termites. And when you place the heavy bureau there, it falls through the floor into the 1st floor apartment, where it lands on the old lady who lives down there and kills her. You had no way to know there was an old lady living down there, but even if you did, you had no way to know that what you were doing was creating any jeopardy for anybody. You could not have known the floor joists had been eaten out by termites. And you shouldn't have known. I mean, there was no reason you could possibly know that. Now, if you were a termite inspector and you had just done a termite inspection of that home and you knew it was infested with termites, then one might argue that even if you didn't actually know those particular floor joists were eaten out by termites, you should have known that the possibility existed because you knew the house, the dwelling, was infested with termites, causing structural damage. But in our scenario, you don't know any of that. You're just visiting your aunt for the first time in a long time. You move the bureau, falls through the floor, completely unpredictable and unforeseeable under any reasonable circumstances, kills the lady below. That death is a genuine legal accident. And you have 0 criminal liability because you had 0 criminal mental state or even civil liability mental state. Now, if you were the termite inspector and you had personal knowledge that termites had been eating at floor joists around the building, causing structural weaknesses and potential points of failure, and then you moved a heavy item from one side of the room to another and it falls through the floor and kills someone, one might argue that you had now committed an act of negligence. Maybe you didn't actually know those particular floor joists were rotten, but you should have known that this event could occur. The heavy object falling through the floor in a structure that you knew was unsound was foreseeable. And an argument could be made that even if you didn't actually know that this was going to happen or there was a high risk of it happening, it was foreseeable. You should have known the danger existed. That's called negligence, that level of mental state of mens rea. Now, negligence creates civil liability. So now, in theory, the survivors of the old lady who died from your negligence could sue you in civil court for wrongful death and recover damages from you, whatever damages an old lady is worth after you've dropped the bureau on her head in a negligent manner. What negligence does not do is create criminal liability. So you might be sued by the old lady's survivors for wrongful death and have to come up with money, but they can't put you in prison, and a civil matter is not within the province of a criminal prosecutor. So you're not facing criminal jeopardy for inactive negligence. You're not facing criminal jeopardy until your mental state, your mens rea, is one of recklessness. Now, recklessness is different than negligence. Negligence is where you did not actually know of the risk you were creating, but it could be argued that you should have known, that you had knowledge in possession that should have made you aware that you were creating that risk. You didn't actually know. No one believes you actually knew, but you should have known. And then your conduct resulted in the foreseeable event, the harm, and you're civilly liable for the harm. That's negligence. Recklessness is where you did know You affirmatively knew. There's no way you didn't know that you were creating an unjustified risk of death to another person, and you did it anyway. And then when that person dies, you have killed them recklessly. Now, you may not have intended them to die, but it's a reckless homicide. And recklessness qualifies for criminal liability because you knew you were creating an unjustified risk of death. You ignored the risk, you did it anyway, and somebody died. And again, the classic example here would be the drunk driver. You know that when you get drunk and you get behind the wheel of a car, you're creating an unjustified risk of death to others. Now, you're not intending to run anyone over. You're not intending to kill anybody. So your state of mind, your mens rea, is not one of intent. You just want to get home. But because of your drunken state operating the vehicle, you manage to run over a pedestrian in a crosswalk and kill them. In getting drunk, getting behind the wheel of the car while drunk, you knew, no reasonable person could not know, that you were creating a risk of unjustified death to others. You did it anyway, despite knowing the risk you were creating, and you killed somebody. That's a reckless homicide. That is criminal. That's a form of manslaughter. Now, it's not murder because you didn't have the intent to kill. Now, if you were driving the car home, sober, imagine, and you saw a long-standing enemy of yours in the crosswalk, and you decided, you know what, this is my opportunity to take that guy out, and you floor the gas pedal, and you run him over with the intention of killing him, that would be a homicide, an intentional, unlawful, unjustified killing of another human being. But your intent there is different than recklessness. In the intentional homicide, you intended the outcome. You intended to kill someone. In the reckless homicide, you're not intending to kill anybody. But you know, you're aware that you're engaged in conduct that is reasonably foreseeable to kill someone, even though that's not your intent. And you ignore the risk, you engage in the conduct anyway, and then somebody dies as a result. Now, there are certain activities that are deemed by the law to be inherently dangerous, where there's so little margin for safety, where it's so easy to unintentionally kill somebody, that the law, in effect, takes away the distinction between mere negligence, good only for civil liability, and recklessness, good for criminal liability. And these types of conduct are inherently dangerous types of conduct, where unintentional death can happen like that. What kind of things are we talking about? If you handle explosives, you're held to the higher legal standard that accompanies being engaged in inherently dangerous conduct, activity. If you prescribe dangerous drugs, you're held to the higher standard, because it would be so easy to give the wrong drugs or the wrong dose to the wrong patient and unintentionally cause a death. If you handle dangerous chemicals that could kill, you're held to the higher standard of being engaged in inherently dangerous conduct. And if you are handling firearms, firearms are by definition inherently dangerous instruments. And if you're handling them, you're engaged in inherently dangerous conduct, and you're held to the higher standard of recklessness. So when I say held to the higher standard, what I mean is it's presumed that you know that you're in handling that, you're creating a risk of foreseeable death to others. And it's your responsibility to take whatever safety measures are necessary to ensure that unintentional death does not occur. You're handling that gun, the safety of that gun is on you, period. There is no mere negligence. If you engage in otherwise negligent conduct while engaged in an inherently dangerous activity, it's recklessness as a matter of law. If you're handling a gun and you're handling it negligently and someone dies as a result, that's recklessness because of the inherently dangerous nature of handling a firearm. Particularly, by the way, when it's so easy to ensure that you're not creating the risk. How do you not create the risk of unintentionally killing someone with a firearm? Well, you could simply make sure there's no bullets in it. It takes a moment. A gun with no bullets in it cannot hurt anybody. Now, of course, we don't presume that a gun has no bullets in it, because how would you know? In fact, all gun training involves the presumption that the gun is loaded. We treat all guns as if they were loaded because they're inherently dangerous instruments, and the risk of unintentional death is so foreseeable if we're mistaken about the state of the gun. So what do we do to avoid making a mistake about the state of the gun? When the gun comes into our possession, you check to make sure it's not loaded, or to confirm that it is loaded if you want it loaded, and then handle it in an appropriate way. What you don't do when handling inherently dangerous instruments is just presume that they're safe. For example, in the case of a gun, just presume because someone else told you so, or because there's a standard policy or practice that the gun is safe to point at another human being. Because you know that if they're mistaken, if there's an error, you could kill another human being. Those are the stakes. So you don't just presume someone else has done their job or checked the gun or is telling you correctly whether or not the gun is loaded. You check for yourself because you're handling an inherently dangerous instrument, and the cost of an error is a human life. And failure to do that, and taking the human life, even unintentionally, is criminally reckless. You know you're creating the risk of unintentional death. You ignore the risk by not ensuring the gun's unloaded. You engage in the conduct anyway, pointing a gun at another human being, and they die as a result. Now, if you point the gun and pull the trigger, you're even more culpable. But if the gun can fire without the trigger being pulled, you're still culpable. You pointed the gun at that other person. And we know this is true because we know darn well that if this scene on the movie set of Rust, where this happened, the name of the Western that was being filmed, if that scene had involved Alec Baldwin pointing that gun at his own head and playing with the hammer, we know he would have double checked to make sure that gun was unloaded, because any reasonable person would have. So I don't care whether or not Alec Baldwin pulled the trigger or not. Or to put it another way, if he pulled the trigger, and based on the FBI examination of the firearm, that certainly appears to have been a requirement for the gun to discharge. If he pulled the trigger, he's only more culpable. But even if the gun could go off simply by twiddling with the hammer, everybody is presumed to know that if you point a gun at another human being and you have not personally ensured it's not loaded, so it could be loaded, so you're pointing a potentially loaded gun at another human being, there's a risk that gun discharges, kills that person. And if you ignore that risk by not ensuring the gun's unloaded and they die as a result, you've created a foreseeable risk of death that's unjustifiable. You ignored that risk and you engaged in the conduct anyway. That is classic recklessness, and recklessness is the mens rea, the mental state required for criminal conviction of manslaughter. So this is a case of, there's a Latin phrase, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. The facts of this case speak for themselves. This is involuntary manslaughter on the part of Alec Baldwin, on these facts as we know them, every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And the medical examiner calling this an accident for medical examination purposes does not change that legal analysis, because recklessness does not require an intent to kill. Accident would require, in a legal sense, would require no mental state that carries legal culpability, but recklessness carries criminal culpability. And that's what was engaged in here by Alec Baldwin. So the medical examination report claiming accident for this does nothing to stop him. By the way, a different medical examiner could just as easily have called this a homicide and been right. Because just like accident in the medical examiner's report doesn't mean this wasn't criminal, homicide in the medical examiner's report wouldn't mean this was criminal. The medical examiner's findings are completely independent. of the legal analysis. Because some homicides, and homicide literally just means one person killed another person. Well, Alec Baldwin killed Halyna Hutchins. Even Alec Baldwin doesn't deny that. It wasn't some other person holding the gun. The gun was in Alex's hand. So characterizing this as a homicide, one person's act killed another person, would be accurate from a scientific perspective. Not all homicides are crimes. People kill people all the time, and it's not a crime. For example, if you kill someone in lawful self-defense, you've committed a homicide, but not a murder. A murder is an intentional, unlawful, unjustified homicide. A killing in self-defense is a lawful, justified homicide. The unlawful, unjustified homicide, if intentional, is a murder. The unlawful, unjustified homicide, if it's done without intent but recklessly, is manslaughter. The unlawful, unjustified death of another by a person, if done in a manner where they should have known they were creating a risk of death but didn't actually know, arguably is negligence. Not grounds for criminal liability, but grounds for civil liability. And the death of another person by yourself or anyone else, done where it was completely unforeseeable that they would die, like moving the heavy bureau and seeing it drop through the floor and strike the old lady below, that's an accident in the legal sense, where there's zero legal liability in the case of a genuine accident. So neither whether or not Alec Baldwin pulled the trigger or not is largely irrelevant. Culpability for reckless homicide, for manslaughter, is established even in the absence of the trigger being pulled. Of course, if he pulled the trigger, it's even worse, because then he's engaging in two independent risks: the pointing of the muzzle at Halyna Hutchins and the pressing of the trigger. But either one of those alone would be sufficient as grounds for reckless homicide, for a manslaughter charge and conviction. Now, having said all that, we've talked about the scientific perspective in the medical examiner's report, which is different than the legal analysis, the legal merits of the case, which I've put forth to all of you here. There's also, of course, the third dimension, which is the politics of the matter. Now, part of the politics here, of course, is that Alec Baldwin is, relatively speaking, a wealthy and powerful man. He's particularly wealthy and powerful within the realm of Hollywood, movie making. The area where this, I would argue, crime occurred in the Taos, Albuquerque, New Mexico area is an area of the country that's long been desperately seeking for more movies to be made there. They're trying to attract Hollywood business. You're less likely to attract Hollywood business if you start prosecuting people who are wealthy and powerful within the Hollywood realm. So there's powerful political motivations, economic motivations, which is just a facet of politics, for not wanting to prosecute Alec Baldwin here. That your region will suffer economically from less Hollywood business if Alec Baldwin's prosecuted in this death. In contrast, Halyna Hutchins was a nobody in Hollywood compared to Alec Baldwin in terms of wealth, prestige, power, influence. Up-and-coming cinematographer, very talented, I'm made to understand, but nothing compared to the multi-decade career of an Alec Baldwin. Alec Baldwin was essential to that movie, for example. He was the premier name on the movie Rust. Nobody much would have cared if Halyna Hutchins, the director of cinematography, had been replaced by some other director of cinematography. Nobody would even have known for all practical purposes. And then there's the other political facet, which is that that region of New Mexico in particular is quite left, quite liberal, so of the same political tribe as Alec Baldwin. If Clint Eastwood had mishandled a gun and killed someone on the movie set in this manner, you think they might have been more inclined to prosecute Clint Eastwood than they are Alec Baldwin, because Clint Eastwood is known to be politically conservative? I think that's a fair inference. So we have whether or not Alec Baldwin could be charged and prosecuted and convicted on the legal merits. I've already covered those. In my opinion, there's no question about it. This is a textbook, law school final exam case of involuntary manslaughter. That's the legal merits. Then we have the political merits. And the political decision on whether to prosecute is political. It involves factors independent of the legal merits, and it falls wholly within the discretion of the local prosecutor. By and large, if a local prosecutor wants to bring charges, off to trial you go. And if they don't, there's not a darn thing that anybody can do about it. And that seems to be where we are. The prosecutor seems to be, who is on the political left, seems to be strongly disinclined to bringing criminal charges against Alec Baldwin. And as long as that's the case, nothing about this is going to change from a criminal perspective. Now, I'm personally much more focused on criminal liability than civil liability. I don't really do much civil work. My understanding is the family of Halyna Hutchins continues. I'm not sure of the status to sue Alec Baldwin. I imagine at some point he'll settle for some dollar amount that will satisfy the Hutchins family, if he hasn't done that already. But that's a separate matter from the criminal liability, which is real and substantive. So we always have to distinguish between what could happen legally. And what could happen here is Alec Baldwin could be prosecuted for involuntary manslaughter under New Mexico law, and on the legal merits ought to be found guilty, convicted, and sentenced. We have to distinguish between what can happen in a legal sense, which is what we all need to be prepared for, because we can't count on the kind of discretion that people like Alec Baldwin routinely get the benefit of. We have to distinguish between what can happen legally, which is what we should expect to happen to us, and what might happen if the user of force gets the benefit of favorable discretion from the authorities, which appears to be what Alec Baldwin is getting here, but should not be expected from a Clint Eastwood or any of us in the same circumstances. I have seen plenty of cases of mishandling of firearms resulting in death prosecuted as involuntary manslaughter. And the person always says the same thing. I didn't know the gun was loaded. It's always the same excuse, when all they had to do was take a moment to check. All right, folks. Let's see if there's any member questions. It was pretty focused. Let's see. Not many law self-defense member questions today. If you members come up with any, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you're a platinum member, put them in the law self-defense platinum member Q&A dashboard. By the way, I should mention, we've been promising our law self-defense members, if you're watching this on YouTube, our members get the same content in their paywalled member access on our site, but they also get a transcript, a written transcript, typed transcript of these shows. At least that's our intent. So we've been struggling a little bit with our transcript service. We're trying out some new services. We got 4 or 5 transcripts from recent shows just arrived in our office today. So those have been posted up. So I know some of you members have been understandably unhappy that you weren't seeing the written transcripts in the blog post, but we should be mostly caught up, maybe with the exception of yesterday. And hopefully we have a better solution now moving forward for those transcripts, for those of you who prefer to read rather than watch the videos. But you only get access to the transcripts if you're a law self-defense member. That's the way that works. You can learn more about law self-defense membership, which, by the way, gets my legal services for free. Normally, those services cost in the multiple of tens of thousands of dollars to have me consult on your use of force case as a legal expert. Our law self-defense platinum members gets that legal consult for free. Doesn't cost them a penny. No retainer, nothing. I'm on their case. My cost is covered by their normal nominal monthly membership for being a law self-defense platinum member. And you can learn more about that at lawselfdefense.com/platinum. All right, let me see if we have any super chats that need to be addressed. First, I have to go here, and then here, and then here. Let's see. Sir Ian, $2 super chat. Thank you, Sir Ian. He writes, the Dumpster Brothers trial delayed a year. Big sad. Yeah, the Dumpster Brothers. This is the event. I believe it was Georgia. It's been a while since I looked, where a very large, muscular man, accompanied by a woman, were throwing a dumpster away. We're throwing a mattress away in a dumpster. They left it beside the dumpster. I forget the details. And they were approached by two, I don't know how to describe it without causing offense, but kind of hillbillies, rednecks, one of them not wearing a shirt. They were armed with a shotgun and a pistol, respectively, father and son, I believe. And a verbal confrontation ensued between the very large, muscular man who took offense at the other two gentlemen telling him he was not allowed to throw his mattress away there. The muscular man becomes very verbally and physically threatening, aggressive, threatening to cause physical harm to the two, the father and son, armed with their guns. The father and son, particularly the father, is returning the goading in kind, suggesting to the muscular man to go ahead, take your swing. Apparently, a swing was taken by the muscular man, and he was shot and killed by the father and son, and now they've been charged in that death. This all happened a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, but the trial was largely suspended because of COVID. It was scheduled to start up again, I believe, on Monday, next Monday. But I've since heard, and Sir Ian here in the Super Chat confirms that the trial, in fact, has been put off for a year, or at least until next year. So I had hoped to start covering that next week, but obviously that's not going to happen. So we'll keep our eyes on that case, and when it does come around to trial, and it's assuming it's being televised, we'll certainly cover it in real time. Dennis Petit, sorry, I don't really know how to pronounce it. $10 super chat. Thank you very much, Dennis. Dennis writes, the Army has embraced the concept of negligent discharge instead of an accidental discharge. Your stance is they should clarify this further and address it as a reckless discharge, punishable USMJ. Yes, I've seen cases where well-intentioned, this was the one that was most recently brought to my attention was a Marine officer. There was a relatively low-level incident at a gate at a Marine base in over in the Middle East. So it was hostile territory, but something happened at the gate that the guards in the towers didn't think was all that important. They weren't too alarmed, but a Marine officer recently arrived, I'm told, grabbed his pistol, which I believe was a Beretta 92, whatever the Marines call those. The officer started running towards the gate, tripped, fell on his face, and discharged the pistol into one of the towers. When he hit the ground, nobody was injured in the course of this, but it cost that Marine officer his career. That was it. Now, I don't know if he was criminally prosecuted beyond that, but he was out, and his Marine career as an officer was over. So certainly they're not treating it as no harm, no foul, right? The consequences were about as severe as they could be for a Marine officer without actually going off to prison, which I don't believe occurred in that case. There's really no accidents, folks. I mean, in theory, could there be an accident with a gun? I mean, if you're handling a gun and I don't know, an engine falls off an aircraft over your head 30,000 feet above, you don't even know it's there, and crashes next to you and startles you to the point that you clench reflexively and the gun discharges. Might that be an accident? I guess maybe. I would still argue the gun should have been pointed in a safe direction when it discharged, right? There's other safety rules. So even if you're startled, could there be a unintentional discharge where you're in a fight over control of a gun and you're not necessarily meaning to shoot the other person, but in the course of the struggle, the trigger gets depressed, the gun discharges? Could you argue that was unintended and should be accidental? Maybe. I mean, it's still a foreseeable risk. And I have seen cases prosecuted. We're struggling over a gun where the courts, the appellate courts felt that maybe the initial struggling itself was not warranted, not necessary. So an unnecessary struggling over a gun where the defendant tried to claim accident to escape criminal liability for the gun discharging and striking someone. That wasn't enough. The court said, no, when you're struggling with someone over a gun that you're creating a risk of the gun discharging. That's recklessness. Unless, of course, you could separately justify having created that risk. All right, folks, I don't think I have anything more today. So here in the Law Self-Defense member, Tom O writes that Alec Baldwin was also the producer, which should mean he has higher standards of responsibility. Certainly in a civil context, I would agree. To the extent he had command and control of the safety, or should have had command and control of the safety practices on the set, then he would bear responsibility to some extent in civil court, completely independent of the fact that he was also the man handling the gun, for sure. And I would expect the trouble is the company producing the movie. Generally, these companies don't have any money. I mean, this was a low budget flick, so they generally don't have anything to take. I'm not sure what kind of insurance they're required to have, but yes, I would expect the producers to be named in the civil suit independently of the fact that Alec Baldwin also happened to be handling the gun when it went off. Whether being the producer would lead to criminal liability, you would need a pretty egregious set of facts. I mean, I could imagine them. If the producer affirmatively knows, for example, that the person they've put in charge of safety isn't showing up for work, so there is no safety, or is a drunk or an incompetent, so there is no safety, is that recklessness? I think the argument can be made, for sure. And of course, if it is reckless, then it is criminal. All right, folks, I think that's about all we have for today. Let me get the comments back up. American Dreamer, $5 super chat. Thank you very much, American Dreamer. He writes, Rakita misses you. Call him. Yeah, I sent Nick some text, but that was early in his vacation, and he had other things on his mind. He was dealing with a YouTube suspension at the time, which I understand has since been lifted, which is good. Yeah, I imagine I'll circle back to Nick when it seems when we have something to talk about. I certainly like being on Rakita Law. That's always great fun. Always have a great time. By the way, for those who don't know, I have a fairly regular guest now on my show, Steve Gosney, who's a public defender doing mostly appellate work down in Florida. He was on a guest on my show yesterday, for example. He's on from time to time when he's available. Think the world of Steve. He's a great attorney and genuinely nice guy. He mentioned to me this morning when I was talking to Steve on the phone about other matters about which I hope to have an announcement soon, a collaboration between Law of Self-Defense and Steve Gosney. Steve mentioned to me that this Sunday, apparently, he's going to be a guest on Nick's show. I forget exactly what they're covering, but I would keep my eyes open for that. So it'll be Nick and Steve Gosney Sunday night on Nick's program over at Rakita Law. I'll certainly take a look at that show, although it's well past my bedtime, and I encourage all of you to do so last night. Oh, Nick said he missed me, apparently. Well, that's very kind of Nick. I missed Nick as well. Hope he had a great time on vacation, and I'm sure we'll connect soon. All right, folks, I think that's all I have for the moment. Until next time, I just remind all of you that if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, and that's why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to make sure you know the law so you're hard to convict. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. Stay safe.